Well, today we're going to talk about why Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. But before we go to that, it was based on a paper, and the paper was based on Josephus. And I learned a lot of new things about it. But first, we're going to go back into the history about things that also caused it. It's called the Jewish resistance or revolt. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE was a decisive event of the First Jewish-Roman War, a major rebellion against Roman rule in the province of Judea. Led by Titus, the Roman forces besieged the city, which had become the stronghold of Jewish resistance. And I never looked at it being Jewish resistance. This is from Wikipedia. After months of conflict, the Romans breached the city defenses, culminating in the destruction of the Second Temple, the razing of the city, and the mass killing, enslavement of displacement for its inhabitants. And the city was destroyed, not only the temple, but usually people just talk about the temple being destroyed. The siege marked the effective end of the Jewish revolt and had profound political, religious, and cultural implications for the Jewish people, as well as broader historical consequences. And we will look in the mindset that occurred long before it occurred. And we'll look at some of the stuff that the disciples did and coins and stuff like that. In the winter of 69-70 CE, Titus led a force of approximately 50,000 troops, including 4 legions of auxiliary forces into Judea. By spring, this army encircled Jerusalem, whose population had swelled with Passover pilgrims and refugees. It started on Passover from across the province. The city, already weakened by infighting upon rival factions led by John of Gashila, Simon bar Goria, and Eliezer ben Simon, who had seized control after the collapse of the moderate rebel government, was cut off from supplies, leaving its inhabitants to suffer from starvation and disease. Despite strong resistance from the defenders, the Romans broke through the city's walls, forcing the defenders into the temple precincts. So you see that in the Jewish community then, there was not unity already before this here started. There was a lot of, and I think people was fighting to be in charge, different people. And it talks about infighting among rival factions. In the summer month of Av, Roman forces breached the Temple Mount and destroyed the Second Temple, an event ceremonied annual in Jewish tradition on the fast day of Tash B'Av. The Romans ultimately captured the entire city, quelling the remaining resistance and inflicting a heavy toll on the population. So it started with the Jews rebelling, with tens of thousands killed, enslaved, or executed. The city was systematically destroyed, leaving only the 3 towers of the Herodian citadel standing as a symbol of its former grandeur. A year later, the Roman victory was celebrated with a grand triumph in Rome, during which hundreds of captives were paraded alongside the spoils of the temple, including the menorah. Monumental structures such as the still standing Arch of Titus were erected in the city to commemorate the conquest. So people still do this today, as they put up to celebrate when they have a victory. And you can see when the United States went into Iraq, one of the things that they did is took down the statues, and that there was televised throughout the whole world. Well, this is the same thing. They was celebrating their victory. After the war, that guy established a military camp on Jerusalem's ruin. A few decades later, the Romans refounded Jerusalem as a colony of Aelia Capitolina, dedicating it to Jupiter and extinguishing Jewish hopes for the restoration of the temple. This set the stage for another major Jewish rebellion, the Bar Kokhba revolt. I had never heard of this, so we're going to look into this also. And doing this here to where the temple was, I believe it was another stab at the Jewish people for their rebellion. This revolt was a large-scale armed rebellion by the Jews of Judea against the Roman Empire, led by Simon Bar Kokhba. I know that I'm not pronouncing that right. It was the third and final major escalation of the Jewish-Roman wars. The revolt began in 132 CE and lasted until 135 or early 136. So it was about the same time, about 3 to 4 years, ending in the total defeat of the short-lived Jewish state. The Romans brutally suppressed the uprising. Bar was killed during the siege and fall of Betar, the last Jewish stronghold, in 135 CE. So this here, the destruction of the temple was not the end of this controversy between the Jews and Rome. And when you look today, I believe this battle is still going on. In its aftermath, the Romans increased their military presence and implemented unpopular changes to the province administration and economic systems. As you will see, this dealt with the economy. So to go and look at some of the things that started it, we will go back and look to the history of why the Jews rebelled. And we will look at the same thing goes on today here in America and throughout the world. For 2 Samuel 24, and again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go, number Israel and Judah. We today call this a census, and we'll get more into that. For the king said to Joab, the captain of the host, which was with him, go now through the tribes of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, and number ye the people, that I may know the number of the people. And Joab said unto the king, now the Lord thy God add unto the people how many soever they be, and hundredfold, and that the eyes of the Lord the king may see it. But why doeth my lord the king delight in this thing? Notwithstanding, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the host. And Joab and the captains of the host went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. So they had the census. They had a history going way back about counting the people, or a census. And this is from 1 Chronicles 24 as another account. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. And David said to Joab and to the rulers of the people, go, number Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, and bring the number of them to me, that I may know it. And Joab answered the Lord to make his people 100 times so many more as they be, but the Lord the king, as they are not all my Lord's servants, why then doeth the Lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of trespass to Israel? And down below, why are the census usually considered a sin in the Old Testament? And so when you see the Jews, when they started having this problem in the mid-60s, AD 60s, you can see that they had a history about these things already. Here is a 1950 census of population and housing. And if you see up the top, clear up at the top, it says, this census report cannot be used for purposes of taxation, investigation, or regulation, but it is used for that. But they have to put that disclaimer up there to start out with. So it's still going. Census taker in the early 1900s. I remember the last census, I said, I'm not going to partake of it. And when I was walking out of my house one day, an Oriental woman came up, young woman came up, and she started talking to me, and she says, I'm a census taker, and you didn't participate in it. And so she sat there and she she asked me questions, and I says, okay, now you're involved in the census. And says, okay, whatever you want. Let's go to Luke now. And we're going to use different versions. I always use the King James Version. When I don't, I will let you know what version, and we're going to compare some different versions of the Bible. Luke 2:1, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Now, the AFV version says, now it happened in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Now it came, and in the BBE, now it came about in those days that an order went out from Caesar Augustus that there was to be a numbering of all the world. And now the BSB, now in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census should be taken of the whole world. And when you read some of these things, when people study the history, they wonder why that some people refuse to vote, because it's registering you. Matthew 17. And when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? He said, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Peter said unto him, of strangers. Jesus said unto him, then are the children free? Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up. And when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money that take and give unto them for me and thee. There is more behind this, which we will see from Ellen White. And if I would have done this in the year 2000 instead of what I did with the IRS, I wouldn't have had the problems I had in those 10 years if I had done it differently. So this is from Desire of Ages. Soon after they reached the town, the collector of the temple revenue came to Peter with the question. Now you will see when this thing happened in 70 AD, it all came to the temple tax or the temple revenue. That's what it was all about. Doth not your master pay tribute? This tribute was not a civil tax, but a religious contribution. Notice they don't call it tax, but a contribution, which makes it's okay to be involved with it, which every Jew was required to pay annually for the support of the temple. A refusal to pay the tribute would be regarded as disloyal to the temple. In the estimation of the rabbis, a most grievous sin. And we look at that today as like one of the pastors. The Savior's attitude toward the rabbinical laws and his plain reproofs to the defenders of tradition afforded a pretext for the charge that he was seeking to overthrow the temple service. Now his enemies saw an opportunity of casting discredit upon him in the collection of the tribute. They found a ready ally. But that's not the end of this. Continuing, in the time of Moses, when the Levites were set apart for the service of the sanctuary, they were given no inheritance among the people. So the Levites did not pay tribute. The Lord said, Levi hath no part nor inheritance with his brethren. The Lord is his inheritance. Deuteronomy 10:19. In the days of Christ, the priests and Levites were still regarded as especially devoted to the temple and were not required to make the annual contribution for its support. Prophets were also exempt from this payment. In requiring the tribute from Jesus, the rabbis were setting aside his claim as a prophet or teacher and were dealing with him as with any commonplace person. So if he had come out and said and made a payment, they would say, you claim to be a prophet, but we know prophets don't pay this, so you're not a prophet. And he got around this by telling Peter to go to the fish's mouth and get it. And there is always a different way to do things. Christ is the answer to all things. If Jesus had paid the tribute without a protest, he would virtually have acknowledged the justice of the claim, but would thus have denied his divinity. But while he saw good to meet the demand, he denied the claim upon which it was based. In providing for the payment of the tribute, he gave evidence of his divine character. And you see, when we read through the Bible, we don't get this here background about what was going on then. I thank Mrs. White for having these things available for us to learn about. Okay, now we're going to go into this paper, and the quotes from the paper is done by James McLaren, and it's called Theocracy, Temple and Tax, Ingredients for the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70. It's based on the works of Josephus, who was an eyewitness to the events in 70 AD. But before we start, the disciples had questioned the tax. This is under the title, the temple tax, which we had just talked about. And is there issues about taxation today? Well, it goes that people are talking about tariffs, they're talking about taxes, they're talking about all kinds of things that surround the same issue of money. Let's see here. So his work is Census and the Tax Dispute. His work is based on three things: the Census and Tax Dispute of 65 and 66, the Temple Orientation of the Revolt, and the Theoretic Manifesto of the Revolt. And we're just going to deal with the first one here, because this is based on why that they had this revolt. The Jews had this revolt. Oops. Because this is no canon that is not in the Bible and not from Mrs. White, some of it may be classified as opinion, as Jehoshaphat may have had a bias of what he saw. There is other descriptions of what happened during that time, and they have always been compared with what Josephus said that he saw. And so this here, there may be opinions of what he has in this article that are different from what other people said. This is like a disclosure of what he saw of this paper. Joseph was very close to the event when it occurred, and he wrote them later, and some things may have changed a little from things that might have changed his persuasion of what happened then. There has been documents obtained from Masada, also from the Dead Sea Scrolls, also obtained. This is Joseph's analysis, or Josephus's analysis of what occurred. And going back to Wikipedia, in the revolt's first year, the Jews minted only silver coins, which were struck from the temple store of silver. So It was the official. The newly minted silver coins included shekels, half shekels, and quarter shekels, each being labeled with the year of minting and their denomination, and depicted a chalice on a verse with the year of the revolt above, surrounded by the ancient Hebrew inscription, Shekel of Israel. These budding pomegranates are featured on the reverse with the inscription, Jerusalem the Holy. And we're going to look at those coins that have been recovered in Israel that was done during this revolt. Here is one of them, a coin issued by the Jewish rebels, 68 and 69. And you can see on the left, you can see the bowl. On the right, you can see it's like a pomegranate tree. That's not how, when I grew up, we had a pomegranate. It didn't look like a tree like that. But that there is a reverse of the shekel that was made in, or a coin that was made in 1968 and 1969. Here is another one. In the fourth year of the revolt, 69-70, 3 large sizes of bronze coins were minted, possibly because the supplies of temple silver were diminished. And you can see they're basically the same, except on the right, you can see that the pomegranate tree is a little different than the one previously. This 2,000-year-old coin commemorates a Jewish rebellion against Rome. An ancient Jewish coin this is from the other revolt in 1935 against the Romans, bearing its name of its leader, which we talked about. The destruction of Jerusalem by the overwhelming mint of Roman military power makes the decision to fight look like a forlorn one. How could the Jews ever had hope to defeat, let alone hold out against the well-trained and conquering legions of Rome? And this is from page 4 of this the document. In other words, when you really have no form to win this war, you go out and fight anyway, knowing that you're going to be defeated. That's what the question was there. Position on the eve of the war, commencing in his narrative, Josephus has a character, Agrippa II, speak to the Jews in Jerusalem about the stupidity of trying to oppose Rome. It shows where that one of Josephus's books where you can find that. So, in other words, they was trying to prevent the war before it starts with dialogue, simply to what people do today. This is why that there's people from the United States, from the White House, that's meeting. They have been meeting this week with people from Iran, and they're trying to get over some of the issues that are between these two nations, actually with Israel too. But they're dialoguing, and this here happened on the eve before that they was trying to avert this. Josephus realized before the war that fighting against Rome would end in disaster. Direct Roman involvement in the affairs of the Jews in Judea and the surrounding territory had commenced in 63. By 66, Rome claimed oversight of how the territory would be administered for the over 120 years. So it started actually before AD 66. These things was going on before, and it wasn't averted. In particular, the very existence of the coinage minted during the war acts as tangible reminder of the constructing nature of the war, at least in the eyes of those responsible for its production. The coinage conveys a sense of hope and expectation free of the bitterness of experience derived from the harsh suppression of the revolt, as it is in the pages of Josephus's narrative. And that there is is his comment about Josephus's narrative. Josephus goes out of his way to ensure that the reader sees the census is highly significant. And as I brought up before, even though here in the United States, they say the census has nothing to do with taxation, but people know that it does have significant in taxation. And the Jews back then knew that the census has a great deal to do with the taxation that they was involved with. The reference to the census as an occasion to introduce its readers to the philosophy that is linked with a person named Judas. Apparently, this new philosophy was totally opposed to Rome rule and saw the impression of the census at turning the Jews into slaves. And so when the people see the census, they're looking at the census as when they have to be registered as becoming a slave. And there is people on the planet today that see this same thing. Look at this in regard to the National Sunday Law, which is why I put up there, and this is on page 8. He is equally direct and overt in claiming that Jews who adopted such a line of thinking did not represent the majority accepted view. They were radical Jews who stood outside the mainstream of Jewish thinking. And so when we talked about there was chaos, there was things going on in the Jewish thing, this is part of it then, that the people that stood up against the Romans did not necessarily represent the majority of the Jews that was there. This guy is a key Roman named in the connection between Judas and the census, and it was made explicit. But Josephus porting the taking of the census in itself does not appear to have been the main concern. Hence, it is not surprising that he makes no effort to refer to any later census registration as part of his account. Josephus displays little interest in describing practical administration activities. And I have wondered in doing this here, did this whole thing have anything to do with today in making payments as a tithe to the church is not taxable? It may refer back to this when when the taxation started, that it makes it separate. The year before the war, the primary purpose of the census was to provide Nero with accurate information about the number of Jews in order to impress upon the emperor the value of seeking a conciliatory path in dealing with them. In other words, of how to deal with the Jews. In context of celebrating Passover, the priests undertook a count as the celebrating Passover. The priest undertook a count of the population, and the name of this priest, his name is Loazar, the high priest at the time. The main purpose of the census was to help determine the level of direct taxation applicable in a given territory. People and land were registered. Rome claimed tax for the living and for working the land. Well, I wonder, tax for the land, why did they have to say tax for the living? Did they also have to tax for the non-living or anything like that? I found that why it was for the living and for working the land. So if the land wasn't being worked, was it not taxed? It is understandable that the Jews would see this as accounting to slavery. And this is Antiquity, in his book of Antiquities. So it's very obvious back then that the census was directly for the taxation. In Egypt, the census was every 14 years. Every place else, it was 15 years. Every 10 years, the U.S. Census Bureau conducts a census to determine the number of people living in the United States. The U.S. Census Bureau conducts a census in years ending in 0 on Census Day, which is April 1, and that is mandated in the Constitution to know that, yeah, this stuff still goes on today. Updating the registration list had two main consequences: adjusting the tax assessment and deciding how to reconcile any outstanding amount of tax due. And if your house, they come, I know my county, they come out and every so often they do a assessment of my house and the land it is on, and that their assessment is on the value, but I know it is on how much taxes that they are going to charge, and they do that for every home within the city. So the same thing happens today. Let's see, I need to go back. Unfortunately, Josephus does not indicate the exact timing of the census. The earliest date would be 63 AD. And the visit and the registration are connected with the Passover festival. So their census they did was around Passover. And Passover was a memorial from the Jews' exodus from Egypt. And last Sunday was Passover, and that was exactly the same day many years ago that Jerusalem was destroyed. Despite what Josephus claimed in this here book, the primary purpose of the registration was to update the tax assessment records for the province. The revised levy that Jews were to pay Rome in direct taxation was being decided. It is not a surprise. In other words, they knew it was coming before then. It was only an unrepresentative minority of Jews who called for armed resistance. Josephus depicts most of the sensible Jews, especially the aristocrats, as arguing for a peaceful revolution to affairs. You notice when Christ was dealt with the tribute, you seen that he gave a peaceful revolution to affairs. It was a few people, a minority of the Jews called for this armed resistance. A dispute regarding taxation due for payment between Roman officials and Jewish leaders early in the summer of 66 AD. Josephus claims that Florus, the governor, moved to Jerusalem and extracted 17 talents from the temple treasury. He claimed that it was for the emperor. He gave his justification, but Josephus claims it was really for personal gain. So he just went in there and took the money, and this is the tax. It's kind of what they do today. You know, you have a bank account, they go and levy the bank account, and they take it. Do you have a remedy for that? Do you have, if there's any due process? No, that's just what they do. You know, so they do the same thing. It is legitimate to speculate that it was provided to him by those Jews responsible for overseeing the treasury, given the lack of any reference to him, forcibly extracting the money. Later, Florus is depicted as trying to gain access to the temple, only be denied by some Jews who had barricaded the prison. So after it happened one year, the next year, the Jews learned and they barricaded the temple so he couldn't go in and collect the tax. And that caused a big problem. Almost as an afterthought in the long speech allocated to Agrippa II, reference is made to an amount of tax due, 40 talents. Furthermore, in that final advice, Agrippa offers to the Jews to avoid being charged with insurrection. He states that they should restore the purchases and pay the tax. And that would have avoided everything. Agrippa said, pay the tax, you know, and it would have all been resolved. Furthermore, was the tax overdue from the previous cycle, or was it part of the current assessment? Josephus was not always careful with his figures, and that probably comes from other writers that wrote about the same problem. It is likely that some adjustment of the tax levy had occurred, and what was taking place in Jerusalem in 66 was a dispute over the payment of an increase of the levy. You know what a levy is? What we're talking about, a levy on a bank account. This was a levy that they had placed on the temple for the temple tax on the temple. Florus may have been confrontational in the way he handled the situation, but as Josephus has Agrippa II state, in the refusal to pay the tax was an act of rebellion. So when it's called the Jewish rebellion, is what caused the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It was actually the act of rebellion was a refusal to pay the temple tax. When the governor then tried to take control of the temple, he met with active resistance. Jews fought against the Romans and barricaded access to the temple. Florus had gone too far in his attempt to assert Roman authority. He deemed the contents of the temple treasury as accessible to the needs of Rome. And I have a misspelled word too there. So when the IRS today deems that they have access to your temple, they just go and take it. It is the same mechanism. Rome thought that they could go in there and take what they wanted when they needed to access the taxes that they deemed was due. According to his custodians, the temple and its treasury did not belong to Rome. The question came down to who had the authority to access the temple treasury. In response to the failure of the Jews to meet their allocated obligation as determined by the recent census undertaken by Celsus. And so, who has the authority to access the temple treasury? Well, it's the same thing as today's money. Pay on to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. So the government has access to your checking account now, on your bank account. Now, in the very soon future, we're going to know that we cannot buy or sell unless you have permission by them. So this thing that was going on then, we're going to see come again to us when we are not allowed to buy and sell. But it's a little different because we aren't protesting. We will just say we are standing up, and we are not going to agree with Babylon and their dictates. The governor and his troops were physically prevented from gaining access in the temple. And this is from page 17. There was only 19 pages to this article, and I just was going through it. Sacrifices were offered in the temple on behalf of Rome and the emperor twice a day. Well, you know, being after the death of Christ, the sacrifices was not needed to be offered in the temple. So but this was done on behalf of Rome. So was they trying to appease somebody? By implication, stopping the custom would signify that the Jews no longer accepted their status as subjects of Rome. Hence, it is understandable that Josephus describes the decision to cease the practice as an act of war. In respective of what the real level of protest was, the decision to cease offering sacrifices for the welfare of Rome stood. The temple was no longer used to pay homage to Rome. And I think I only got a couple left. This is a reproduction. Silver coins were minted from the first year of the war and then bronze coins were added from the second year. Hand-struck silver Jewish half-shekel coin, and that there is, they have the original right there in the first revolt. This was 66, 67. This meant was struck in Jerusalem. And you can get a reproduction of this coin today. I did not go and price it, but you can get these coins today. No longer were Jews constrained to using the foreign coin with images and legends that compromised their principles. See, some people, you know, when the coin was made with the King Agrippa or Herod's picture on there, that was against what the Jews believed, because you should not have any images on coins. You can have other things, but not images of persons on them, and that compromise their principles. And that is the end of it. Let's see here.
Thank you, Keith. That was a lot of interesting information there.
Well, I read this article and I said, you know, that would be very interesting, because we know what that it was caused. But people always today, they look, well, that was Rome, they just overthrew, but they didn't. But when you go and look at the documents, it's always referred to as the rebellion of the Jews. Well, the rebellion of what? It was a paying of the Roman tax. And you see this thing, it's the same thing that's going off today. Look at the tariffs. It's a big thing, you know, among some of these nations. Trump come up and says, we're not paying tariffs no more. That's not equal. And
Right.
you see the Jews had that same type of thing back there, but they refer to it as slavery. We're not going back to slavery like we was back in Egypt.
I just want to mention
Anybody have anything to say?
he mentioned that the temple was destroyed at the time of Passover, and that wouldn't be so, because it Av is not the same as Aviv, and so it'd be like the fourth month instead of the first month. So I just wanted to make that correction.
Well, that's what was reported, and it's in, if you go to the Great Controversy, the 1884 version, that's not the one to 1888 or 1911. In the beginning of it, Mrs. White says that the war started on Passover.
But the temple was not destroyed until the 9th of Av, and it's been that way both times.
That lasted about 6 months, the war did. So you're right, it wasn't destroyed that first day, but that's when the war started.
Yeah.